Remember those thrifty breakfasts your grandma used to whip up without breaking a sweat? Or the bank? Back in the 1950s, a carton of eggs and a bag of flour could stretch across a whole week of hearty morning meals. These weren't fancy cafe plates. They were hot, filling, and made with what was already in the kitchen. Let's dust off those old-school staples and revisit 30 cheap American breakfast recipes that fed a generation. Cornmeal mush might not sound glamorous because it isn't, but in the 1950s, this humble dish was a quiet hero of the American breakfast table, especially in homes that knew the value of stretching a dollar. Born from Southern kitchens and carried through the lean years of the Great Depression, cornmeal mush was the kind of food that stuck to your ribs, cost next to nothing, and made you feel like you'd actually eaten something before heading out to work, or school, or the fields, or wherever the day took you. At its core, it's as simple as it gets: water, cornmeal, and a pinch of salt. That's it. Stirred slowly over a stovetop until it thickens into something between porridge and polenta. In the mornings, it was ladled hot into bowls, sometimes with a splash of milk or a sprinkle of sugar if the pantry allowed. But the real magic happened the next day. Leftovers were poured into a loaf pan and chilled overnight until firm. Then, this is where the 1950s kitchen ingenuity came in. It was sliced and fried in bacon grease until the edges turned crisp and golden. What was once a gloopy pot of cornmeal became crispy breakfast squares, served with syrup or apple butter, maybe even next to a sausage link if payday had just passed. There's something deeply nostalgic about cornmeal mush. It carries the scent of old kitchens and wood stoves, of quiet mornings when the house was still half asleep. For many, it was the kind of food your grandparents made without measuring a single thing, just muscle memory and frugality. And today, while TikTok's busy reinventing oatmeal as overnight parfaits in mason jars, cornmeal mush remains gloriously untrendy. But maybe that's the point. It was never about aesthetics. It was about survival, about making the most of what little you had and turning it into something warm, filling, and oddly comforting. A lesson we might just need again.
Here's my plate of cornmeal mush. And more or less, I like to have it with marinara sauce on it.
Creamed chipped beef on toast, known less formally and with more military sarcasm as SOS.
We are making SOS. You're not going to want to miss this one.
Was a staple on 1950s breakfast tables, especially for families with military ties or tight grocery budgets. The name, short for stuff on a shingle, though the original wasn't quite that polite, hints at its utilitarian nature. This was food meant to be fast, filling, and frugal, not fancy. Born in the barracks and adopted in post-war kitchens, SOS became a kind of comfort food, especially for veterans who had grown oddly fond of it during service. The dish itself is startlingly simple. Thin slices of dried beef, often the kind packed in little glass jars, salty enough to last forever, are chopped and stirred into a thick white sauce made from flour, butter, and milk. The whole mess is ladled generously over toasted white bread. It's creamy, salty, and oddly satisfying, especially when served hot and in abundance. Families in the 1950s appreciated that it could feed a lot of mouths with very little meat. Dried beef was cheaper than bacon, easier to store than sausage, and the milk-based gravy made it stretch like no one's business. Kids might have groaned at the sight of it, but there was something reliable about SOS. It always showed up when times were tight, when mom needed to make something out of almost nothing. And for those who grew up on it, the dish holds a weird sort of nostalgia. Not glamorous, not gourmet, but grounding. It was there after long shifts, during slow weeks, and on cold mornings when nothing else sounded good. Today, it's mostly vanished from mainstream breakfast menus, unless you're in a diner with a sense of humor or a retro theme. But for those in the know, creamed chipped beef on toast is more than just a military relic. It's a reminder of how American kitchens once fed whole families with ingenuity, powdered milk, and a sense of humor. Because sometimes a little salt, some sauce, and a slice of toast really are enough to start the day. Canned hash and eggs may not win any awards for elegance, but in the 1950s, it was the unsung hero of countless American breakfasts.
This delicious corned beef hash.
It came in a squat tin, often branded as corned beef hash or roast beef hash, promising a fast, filling, and frugal meal that required nothing more than a can opener and a hot skillet. And for post-war families juggling tight budgets, full houses, and early mornings, that was all they needed. The hash itself was a chaotic yet oddly comforting blend of minced meat, potatoes, and seasoning, all cooked down to a uniform mush that somehow worked. Once it hit a sizzling pan, preferably cast iron, it would crisp up around the edges, developing a golden brown crust that was pure breakfast magic. And the eggs? They were often cracked directly on top of the hash in the skillet, their yolks settling into little craters like suns rising over a meat and potato landscape. Some folks liked their eggs runny, soaking into the hash like gravy. Others wanted them firm, no nonsense, like the era itself. There was a kind of quiet ritual to it. You'd hear the can crack open, the hiss of the pan, the soft clink of eggshells. Maybe the radio was playing in the background, Elvis or Perry Como, and the kitchen smelled of coffee and canned meat, oddly homey. Hash and eggs were the go-to on busy weekdays or lazy Saturdays, something Dad could make without much fuss, or Mom could whip up while juggling a million other tasks. These days, hash has made a comeback in brunch spots with names like artisanal beef and root veg medley, served on reclaimed wood plates with poached eggs and microgreens. But no version hits quite like the one from the can, fried to a crisp and served unpretentiously on a chipped diner plate. It's a dish that speaks to practicality, to making do, to feeding hungry mouths with what you had and making it delicious. Canned hash and eggs didn't pretend to be fancy. It just showed up every time, with sizzling patience and a fried egg on top. Lard biscuits were a staple in 1950s American kitchens, especially in the South and in rural communities where stretching a grocery dollar was a weekly sport. Today, lard might make people pause, wrinkle their noses, or reach for the olive oil instead. But back then, it was just common sense. Butter was expensive, shortening was a luxury for some, and lard, well, lard came from what you already had. It was cheap, flavorful, and, if you were lucky enough to raise your own pigs, practically free. The process was simple, passed down without a recipe card. Flour, baking powder, salt, and lard, cut in with a fork or more often, just bare hands. Add a splash of milk or buttermilk if you had it, and then pat out the dough on a floured table and cut it into rounds using whatever glass was clean. No fancy tools, no need for perfection. You pop them in the oven until they rose up fluffy and golden.
Oh yeah, look at that. Okay, those are good and golden. Now, the butter.
The tops kissed with a crunch and the insides tender as a morning hymn. There was a ritual to these biscuits. They weren't just food. They were the centerpiece of breakfasts, the companion to fried eggs, the sandwich to cold ham, or just a delivery system for syrup or apple jelly. You didn't eat just one, you ate 3, and then maybe one more while standing at the counter because they were still warm. Despite their frugal roots, there was pride in a good biscuit. They were judged not just on taste, but on flake, height, and how easily they split open with steam rising like a good secret. And lard gave them that signature richness. No artificial taste, just pure, honest fat that got the job done. In today's world of vegan butter and gluten-free everything, lard biscuits might seem like a culinary relic, but they're also a reminder of a time when food was simple, satisfying, and didn't try to impress anyone. It just fed you, heart and soul, every morning it needed to. Peanut butter toast with bacon drippings might sound like a heart attack waiting to happen, but in the 1950s, it was breakfast gold. This was the kind of meal you threw together when groceries were running low, but you still needed fuel to make it through a long day. It was rich, salty, and utterly satisfying. Proof that the best things in life don't always come from a cookbook. Here's how it went. You fried up a pan of bacon, saved the rendered fat, because no one in their right mind threw away bacon grease.
So you can see there that the water's pretty much evaporated and it is starting to brown up on the edges.
And poured just a little over a slice of toasted white bread. Then came a thick layer of peanut butter, the cheap kind that's separated in the jar, and maybe a second slice of toast on top if you were feeling bold. The heat from the bacon fat would melt the peanut butter ever so slightly, creating a salty sweet blend that hit you right in the taste buds and sat heavy in your stomach in the best possible way. This wasn't a dish born out of indulgence. It was born out of pure, unfiltered resourcefulness. Moms in the 1950s knew how to make flavor out of scraps, and bacon grease was liquid gold. It flavored vegetables, coated skillets, and yes, found its way into more than a few surprising breakfasts. Pair it with a strong cup of percolated coffee, and you had a meal that could carry you straight through lunch. Peanut butter toast with bacon drippings was never fancy, never advertised, and never written on a chalkboard cafe menu. It was quiet kitchen genius, the kind that got passed down with a shrug and a wink. And even though today's nutrition labels might throw a fit, there's something undeniably nostalgic about it. It reminds us of a time when people ate what they had, wasted nothing, and understood that flavor wasn't found in some diet plan. It was sitting right there in the skillet, waiting to be remembered. Molasses and butter bread was the kind of breakfast you didn't brag about. You just ate it quietly, gratefully, while the morning sun crept through the kitchen curtains and the coffee perked in the corner. In the 1950s, this humble slice was a frequent visitor at the table, especially in homes where sugar was scarce, money was tight, and taste still mattered. It wasn't anything fancy, just a thick slice of bread, usually homemade or yesterday's loaf, slathered with real butter and a generous drizzle of molasses.
I suggested an absolute winner of a recipe. They said that molasses raisin bread was their favorite bread ever.
There was a dark, sticky sweetness to it, deep and earthy, not like the sugary cereals and neon-colored spreads that would take over the breakfast aisle in the decades to follow. Molasses came from the bottom of the barrel, literally. It was what was left after the sugar was extracted from cane or beets. But in a 1950s kitchen, that meant it was affordable, shelf-stable, and flavorful. It was the working-class sweetener, the Depression-era standby, and a taste of childhood for generations. Paired with butter, it became breakfast, quick, nourishing, and deeply comforting. For many kids, molasses bread was eaten sitting at the table before school, their legs swinging above the linoleum, lunch pails waiting by the door. It was often eaten cold, but sometimes toasted, the butter melting and mixing with the syrupy molasses to form little caramelized pockets on the surface. It stuck to your fingers, your face, and sometimes your shirt, but it stuck with you too. Today, molasses is more likely to show up in a gingerbread recipe or a specialty health store, labeled unsulfured and twice the price. But back then, it was just what you had in the pantry, a little jar of depth and sweetness when there wasn't much else to go around. Molasses and butter bread didn't need advertising or innovation. It just needed a slice of bread, a little fat, a little sugar, and someone hungry enough to know that was more than enough. Baked egg and potato nests may sound like something from a trendy brunch spot with $16 mimosas, but in the 1950s, it was pure homegrown ingenuity. This was the kind of dish that looked fancy, but was really just a clever way to dress up two pantry staples, eggs and potatoes, for families who needed to stretch both without skimping on comfort. It offered all the charm of a special breakfast without the expense, and it made resourcefulness look downright elegant. The idea was simple but brilliant. You'd grate raw potatoes, mix them with a little salt, maybe some onion or leftover lard if you were feeling generous, and press them into muffin tins or ramekins to form little nests. Then you'd bake them just long enough to crisp the edges and set the shape.
All right, I'm gonna pop these into a 450-degree oven for just about 15 or 20 minutes.
Once the shells were sturdy and golden, you'd crack an egg into the center of each one and slide the whole tray back into the oven. The eggs would bake gently, their whites settling in the nest and their yolks gleaming like golden suns. What emerged from the oven looked far more impressive than the ingredients led on. This dish had a quiet theatricality to it. It was the kind of breakfast that might show up when company came over or when mom wanted to make something feel special, even if the fridge was nearly bare. It didn't need meat, it didn't need cheese, and it didn't need fuss. Just a hot oven and a little care. Served with toast or maybe applesauce on the side, it was satisfying and simple, and it filled the house with the kind of warm, savory scent that made everyone come to the table fast. In today's world, we might call it low carb or post it under hash brunch goals, but back then, it was just a smart, tasty way to make do. And sometimes making do was how families created meals that still linger in memory long after the nests were gone. Flour scrambled eggs might sound like a culinary mistake, but in the 1950s, it was a quietly brilliant way to feed a crowd when you didn't have enough eggs to go around. Eggs were relatively cheap back then, sure, but not always cheap enough. Families with multiple mouths to feed and one carton left until payday had to get creative. Enter this humble trick: a spoonful of flour mixed into the beaten eggs, making them stretch just a little farther, fluff up a little higher, and leave no one at the table going hungry. The process was simple, almost sneaky. You'd beat your eggs like normal, whether you had 2 or 6 didn't matter, then whisk in a bit of all-purpose flour, maybe a touch of milk or water to loosen things up. Some folks added baking powder for extra volume, others seasoned with just salt and pepper. When poured into a hot skillet, the eggs puffed up ever so slightly, becoming a little more substantial than they really were. It was eggs, but with a little filler, a little extra body, a little trickery that most kids never even noticed. And while purists might scoff, flour scrambled eggs had their own charm. They were firmer, with a bit more bite than traditional scrambled eggs, and they paired beautifully with toast, ketchup, or even a spoonful of last night's gravy if you were really leaning into the moment. More importantly, they meant nobody had to skip breakfast. They turned not enough into just enough, which for most 1950s households was the whole point. Today, you probably won't find flour scrambled eggs on a brunch menu next to $6 egg whites and avocado toast, but maybe you should. They're a reminder of a time when frugality was not only necessary, but respected, when stretching ingredients was an art form passed from mother to daughter, skillet to skillet. And while we might not need to stretch our eggs quite so thin now, it's still comforting to know the trick's there when we do. Oven-baked custard was one of those 1950s breakfasts that blurred the line between dessert and necessity, and no one seemed to mind. It was rich without being fussy, sweet without going overboard, and it made the whole kitchen smell like comfort itself. In an era when ingredients were simple and every meal had to pull its weight, custard was a clever way to use what was already in the pantry: milk, eggs, sugar, and a bit of vanilla if you had it, or nutmeg if you were feeling fancy. The magic happened slowly, gently. You whisked together the ingredients, poured the mixture into small glass dishes or a casserole dish, and baked it in a water bath until it set into a silky, spoonable delight.
And then I'm gonna just place my Crocs in that water.
The top would develop the lightest golden skin, just enough to hint at the warmth inside. It was a patient kind of food. No shortcuts, no rushing, but the result was worth every minute. Some served it warm, straight from the oven. Others preferred it chilled, a cool treat waiting in the icebox for breakfast the next day. For many families, oven-baked custard was what you made when you had a few eggs left and weren't sure what else they could become. It was economical, but never felt stingy. Grandmothers made it for grandkids with colds, or as a soft, comforting meal for those too small or too old to chew.
These baked custards can be served warm or cold and are perfect for dinner parties.
It carried the weight of tradition and care, spoonful by gentle spoonful. Today, custard lives on in the form of creme brulee or custard tarts at high-end bakeries, but its roots are humbler and maybe sweeter for it. In the 1950s, this dish didn't need a blowtorch or a caramelized top. It just needed a warm oven, a quiet morning, and someone to sit at the table and eat it slowly. In a world that moves too fast and skips breakfast more often than not, maybe we could all use a little more custard in our lives. The kind that fills you up, calms you down, and tastes like home in a spoon. Sourdough hotcakes were the quiet stars of many 1950s breakfasts, especially in households where wasting food was unthinkable and flavor came from time, not shortcuts. These weren't your standard boxed mix pancakes. They were born from bubbling jars of starter kept alive on kitchen counters like sour-smelling pets, passed down from generation to generation. That starter, a fermented mix of flour and water, was the soul of the dish, lending the hotcakes a tangy depth that made every bite feel like a connection to something older than the breakfast table itself.
And you get to savor the homemade sourdough pancake flavor that sets these apart from all other pancakes.
Making sourdough hotcakes wasn't a spur-of-the-moment affair. The starter had to be fed, stirred, and coddled days in advance. The batter, often mixed the night before, sat covered until morning, when it was livened up with a little baking soda to give it a fluffy lift. Cooked on a well-greased cast-iron skillet, they sizzled and browned around the edges, giving off a warm, yeasty scent that filled the house and nudged even the grumpiest family members out of bed. They weren't sweet unless you made them that way. You could eat them with just a pat of butter, a drizzle of syrup, or more often in the 1950s, a dollop of fruit preserves or canned peaches. The texture was different too, more chewy, more substantial, with a tang that made them unmistakable. They were rustic, hearty, and a little wild in flavor, which made sense for a food that had to be kept alive in a jar all year round. For many families, sourdough wasn't trendy. It was survival. It was a way to bake without store-bought yeast, to make something delicious from flour, water, and patience. Today, we treat sourdough starters like Instagram projects, but back then, it was just how people cooked. Sourdough hotcakes weren't flashy, but they were filling, nourishing, and rich with character. Each one was a small celebration of self-reliance and tradition. Warm from the skillet, soft in the center, and tangy enough to remind you that good food doesn't have to be quick to be worth it. Dry mix waffles with powdered milk were a shining example of 1950s kitchen ingenuity. where convenience met necessity and somehow still managed to taste like a Saturday morning treat. These waffles weren't made from anything fancy. In fact, that was the point. They were assembled from shelf-stable basics, the kind of ingredients you could keep on hand for months without worrying about spoilage. No fresh milk, no problem. Powdered milk was the quiet workhorse of the era, reconstituted with water and whisked into batters like it belonged there all along. The dry mix itself was usually a homemade blend of flour, baking powder, sugar, and salt, measured out in bulk and stored in jars, always ready to go. It was frugal, efficient, and made a hot breakfast just a few cracked eggs and a splash of water away. In a time when families were feeding multiple children on a single income, dry mix waffles were a way to serve something warm and filling without draining the weekly grocery budget. You didn't need fresh butter or real milk, and if eggs were scarce, well, a little extra powdered milk would do the job of stretching the batter. When poured onto a sizzling waffle iron, often cast iron, heavy, and handed down from someone's aunt, the batter would hiss and puff, forming golden waffles with crispy edges and tender middles. They came out with perfect little squares ready to trap syrup, jam, or even just a dusting of sugar. For kids, it felt like luxury. For parents, it was practicality dressed up in sweetness and steam. Powdered milk may not have the romance of cream or the wholesomeness we now associate with farm fresh, but in the post-war kitchen, it was a lifesaver. These waffles weren't just breakfast. They were a symbol of self-reliance, careful planning, and making the most of what was available. Today's boxed mixes try to mimic that nostalgic simplicity, but nothing compares to the real thing. A waffle made from scratch, from storage staples, with a taste that says, "We made it work and we made it delicious." Oatmeal griddle cakes were the 1950s kitchen's answer to leftovers with purpose, a clever reinvention of yesterday's breakfast into today's hearty meal. When you had a pot of cooked oats sitting cold on the stove from the morning before, tossing them out simply wasn't an option. Not when food cost money, and not when that cold lump of oatmeal could be transformed into something golden, crispy-edged, and soul-satisfying.
Oatmeal griddle cakes from Breakfast by Salt Cure.
Enter the griddle cake, a humble but brilliant twist that turned waste into warmth. Moms and grandmas would take that leftover oatmeal, mix it with a bit of flour, an egg if they had one, maybe a splash of milk or water to loosen things up, and then season it ever so slightly with salt or a touch of sugar depending on whether the day leaned sweet or savory. Then came the frying pan, cast iron of course, greased with bacon drippings or lard where the batter sizzled into thick rustic cakes. The outside crisped into a lovely golden crust, while the inside stayed soft and tender, a comforting reminder of its porridge roots. They weren't just practical, they were delicious. Served hot off the griddle, these cakes welcomed a pat of butter, a drizzle of syrup, or a spoonful of fruit preserves. On leaner mornings, you might get them plain, stacked high with nothing but heat and heart. Still, they filled you up in a way that toast or boxed cereal never could. There was a depth to them, a richness of flavor and texture that made them more than just a repurposed meal. They were a triumph of thrift. Today, we might call this upcycling or zero-waste cooking, but in the 1950s, it was just life. You didn't throw out good food, and you didn't need a new recipe to make something new. Oatmeal griddle cakes stood as a quiet testament to creativity, resilience, and the unspoken belief that yesterday's meal could always become something better. They were hot, filling, and proof that with a little time and a hot skillet, even leftovers could taste like love. Rice pudding with raisins was one of those dishes that drifted effortlessly between breakfast and dessert in 1950s kitchens. It was warm, sweet, and familiar, comfort food in the truest sense. When money was tight and mornings were cold, a pot of rice pudding on the stove meant the day was already off to a good start. It didn't take much to make it: leftover rice, some milk, often powdered or evaporated, a bit of sugar, a touch of vanilla if you had it, and of course a handful of raisins tossed in for that chewy pop of sweetness. The beauty of rice pudding was in its simplicity. Leftover rice, often the kind that had gone dry in the fridge overnight, was given new life when simmered slowly in milk. The sugar melted in gently, softening everything into a creamy, porridge-like texture that somehow felt richer than the ingredients implied. The raisins, little golden or dark gems, would plump as they cooked, infusing the whole dish with soft bursts of natural sweetness. A pinch of cinnamon or nutmeg sprinkled on top was the finishing touch, though many went without. It was optional flair in a world where nothing was wasted.
Those great value raisins are mutant. I like the size of the golden raisins.
For many families, this was a breakfast that felt like a treat. It filled the house with the scent of warm milk and sugar, the kind of smell that wrapped around you like a quilt. It was the sort of meal that could keep a child full all morning, make use of every scrap, and still bring a smile to the table. It wasn't flashy, but it was nourishing and deeply comforting. Today, rice pudding often gets dressed up with saffron or cardamom in trendy cafes, but the 1950s version was stripped down, honest, and full of heart. It was about using what you had, making it warm and good, and sitting down with the people you love to share something sweet, maybe not just in taste, but in the way it made you feel. In a world of rush and convenience, rice pudding reminds us that slow, simple things often feed us best. Bread pudding for breakfast was a quiet little miracle in 1950s kitchens, a dish that turned stale ends and forgotten crusts into something warm, filling, and unexpectedly delightful. It was what happened when thrift met comfort, when yesterday's bread became today's centerpiece. In a time when wasting food was almost unthinkable, and every slice of bread had a second chance waiting, bread pudding was more than a sweet treat. It was breakfast with backbone.
Okay, that is what I call a delicious bread pudding.
The process was as simple as it was resourceful. Leftover bread, torn into rough chunks, was soaked in a mixture of milk, often powdered or evaporated, along with a few eggs, sugar, and a dash of vanilla if you had it. Some households added a sprinkle of cinnamon or nutmeg, or tossed in a handful of raisins, depending on what was on hand or who was coming to breakfast. The mixture sat for a few minutes, letting the bread soak up every bit of liquid, and then it went into the oven until puffed and golden, the top crisped to perfection, the inside soft and custardy. The result was something more than the sum of its parts. Warm, gently sweet, and undeniably homey, bread pudding had a way of turning a quiet morning into a memory. Kids might drizzle theirs with a little syrup or a splash of canned cream, while adults paired it with black coffee and a few minutes of peace before the day began. It wasn't flashy, and it didn't pretend to be, but it filled the house with the scent of vanilla and brown sugar and reminded everyone that care didn't require a long ingredient list. Today, bread pudding is often seen on dessert menus, dolled up with bourbon sauce or fancy toppings, but back then it was humble and practical, pulled from necessity and made with love. It proved that even scraps and leftovers with just a little time and heat could be transformed into something comforting, something good. In a world that often overlooks the simple things, bread pudding for breakfast reminds us that warmth and satisfaction are often just a bite and a good idea away. Powdered milk milkshake was the 1950s version of making do with a smile. It wasn't the thick, ice cream-laden shake you'd get at the corner diner with whipped cream and a cherry on top. No, this was the stay-at-home version, born out of necessity, not indulgence, made with pantry staples and a good dose of imagination. For families watching their grocery bills or living far from the nearest store, powdered milk was a lifesaver. It was shelf-stable, cheap, and easy to stretch, and when you mixed it just right, it could become the base for something that felt almost like a treat. To make the milkshake, you'd reconstitute the powdered milk, usually with water that had been sitting in the fridge to make it cold. Then stir in a spoonful of sugar, a splash of vanilla extract, and, if you were lucky, a few ice cubes or even a bit of mashed banana or spoonful of cocoa powder. Some families added a raw egg for protein and richness, back before that idea came with warnings and side eyes. Everything was shaken or blended until frothy.
Papaya milk powder milkshake is ready. Let's serve.
Poured into a glass and served with the quiet hope that it would pass for something a little more indulgent than it really was. Despite its humble ingredients, the powdered milk milkshake carried a certain charm. It was a treat kids could make themselves, a pick-me-up in the middle of a hot day, or a quick breakfast drink when there wasn't much else to work with. It was resourceful, and it didn't pretend to be anything it wasn't. It was cold, sweet, and simple, exactly what you needed when times were lean, but spirits were high. Nowadays, we blend our smoothies with protein powders, chia seeds, and almond milk. But this old-school shake reminds us that luxury doesn't have to come with a label. Sometimes it just comes from making the most out of a tin of powder, a few cupboard staples, and a little creativity. The powdered milk milkshake may not have been fancy, but it got the job done. And it tasted a lot like resilience in a glass. Cinnamon sugar toast soldiers were a simple joy in 1950s American kitchens, a sweet, crispy morning treat that felt like a tiny bit of decadence wrapped in thrift. The name alone sounded playful, even if the process was purely practical. When you didn't have donuts or store-bought cereal, when pancakes were too much fuss and oatmeal felt too heavy, this was the answer. All you needed was a slice or two of bread, a pat of butter, some sugar, and a sprinkle of cinnamon, the kind of ingredients almost every pantry had, even in lean times. The method was straightforward, and many kids could make it themselves. The bread, often plain white sandwich slices, sometimes a day or two old, was lightly toasted, then slathered with butter while still warm. Then came the dusting of cinnamon sugar, a magical mix that every kitchen seemed to have in a recycled jelly jar or a coffee tin with holes poked in the lid. The real artistry was in the cut. Instead of serving the toast whole, it was sliced into neat little strips. Soldiers. Perfect for dipping into soft-boiled eggs or just eating one crispy bite at a time. It made breakfast feel interactive, fun, and oddly elegant for something so humble.
So this level of caramely deliciousness is exactly what I was going for.
For many kids growing up in that era, cinnamon sugar toast soldiers were a rite of passage, the first fancy thing you learned to make, even if no one called it cooking. They were what Grandma gave you on cold mornings when you had to catch the school bus, or what Mom whipped up when time was tight and bellies were growling. Sweet, but not too sweet, crunchy yet comforting, these toast soldiers march straight into the hearts of anyone who tried them. Today, we talk about French toast sticks or artisanal cinnamon breads, but there's something unbeatable about the simplicity of this dish. It didn't cost much, didn't take long, and didn't pretend to be more than it was. And maybe that's why it stuck. Because sometimes the best breakfasts are the ones made from almost nothing at all, except a little love and whatever was on the shelf. Cottage cheese pancakes may sound like the sort of thing a modern-day food blogger might invent in an attempt to pack protein into breakfast. But back in the 1950s, they were born out of something far simpler, stretching the budget while still making something warm, filling, and just a little indulgent. Cottage cheese was cheap, widely available, and long-lasting in the icebox. It also added richness and protein to pancakes, turning them into a meal that could stick to your ribs without sticking to your wallet. These weren't your classic fluffy flapjacks from the diner. Cottage cheese pancakes were thinner, denser, with a golden brown crispness on the outside and a soft, creamy texture inside. They had personality. The tang of the cheese played beautifully against a little sugar and vanilla in the batter, and they sizzled up beautifully in a hot skillet, usually greased with bacon drippings, margarine, or a dab of lard. You'd mix up eggs, flour, a splash of milk, or water and powdered milk depending on the day, and fold in a generous scoop of cottage cheese. Some cooks added a bit of baking powder for lift, but others preferred them flat and custardy, like a cross between a pancake and a farmer's cheese blintz. Served hot off the griddle, these pancakes needed little more than a drizzle of syrup or a spoonful of jam. Some households even topped them with applesauce or sour cream. They were practical, satisfying, and versatile. The kind of dish you could adapt, depending on what you had in the fridge or needed to use up. Today, they're enjoying a quiet comeback, especially in circles that champion high-protein, low-waste meals. But for those who grew up in the 1950s, cottage cheese pancakes were never about trends. They were about getting a warm meal on the table fast. They were the kind of breakfast that said, we might not have everything, but we've got enough. In a world of fleeting food fads, these humble pancakes remind us that true nourishment is often found in the simplest, savviest recipes handed down through generations. Mock cream cheese spread was one of those clever kitchen inventions born of frugality, wartime habits, and the eternal desire to make something feel fancier than it actually was. In 1950s households, especially those still carrying the lessons of the Depression or rationing eras, making do wasn't just a necessity, it was a way of life. Cream cheese was a luxury, and not everyone had regular access to it. But margarine? Cheap, plentiful, and often flavored and colored to look like butter. And unflavored gelatin? A miracle binder that could stretch nearly anything. Combine the two, and you had a passable stand-in for cream cheese that could fool just enough of the senses to pass muster on morning toast. The process was straightforward, but it felt like science. Margarine was melted down, gelatin was dissolved in a little warm water, and the two were whisked together with a bit of milk powder, vinegar or lemon juice for tang, and a pinch of salt. Sometimes cooks added a splash of vanilla or even a spoonful of sugar to round out the flavor. The mixture was chilled until it set into a smooth, spreadable consistency, soft enough to smear on bread, firm enough to feel like the real thing. It didn't quite taste like Philadelphia, but in the right moment with the right expectation, it came close enough. Mock cream cheese spread was often slathered on toast or saltine crackers, sometimes served with jam or apple slices for breakfast or school lunch. It made sandwiches feel a little more indulgent, even if it came from an improvised recipe scribbled on a yellowed index card or clipped from a newspaper. Today, this kind of substitution might sound quaint or even a little bizarre, but it's a reminder of how deeply creative home cooks once were and still are. They didn't wait for perfect ingredients. They made good enough into good. In an age of instant gratification and store-bought everything, this humble spread is a whisper from the past, reminding us that ingenuity, not luxury, is what makes a kitchen truly rich. Spam and potato hash was a breakfast born out of ration stamps and post-war pantry logic, a dish that thrived in the humble kitchens of 1950s America, where nothing went to waste and everything was fried in the same pan. Spam, the canned meat that had won the war effort and then stuck around in peacetime, became a staple not just because it was affordable, but because it lasted forever and could be dressed up to taste like something more than it was. Potatoes, meanwhile, were cheap, filling, and always on hand. Together, they made magic, crispy, salty, savory magic that sizzled its way onto countless breakfast tables. The preparation was unceremonious but deeply satisfying. Leftover potatoes from the night before, or fresh ones peeled and diced if you had a little more time, were tossed into a hot skillet with a bit of fat. Bacon grease was gold, but margarine or even lard worked just fine. The potatoes browned slowly, getting golden at the edges, while cubes of Spam were added and seared until they developed that unmistakable, crispy exterior. Onions might make an appearance if they were around, bringing a little sweetness and bite to the mix. Everything cooked together in the same pan until the textures danced. Crispy bits, soft insides, savory chew. For many families, this was the breakfast of workdays, a hot, hearty plate that could power you through chores, school, or a factory shift. It was especially beloved in colder months, when a warm meal felt like armor against the morning chill. Served with a fried egg on top or a splash of ketchup on the side, Spam and potato hash was comfort food without the marketing. It didn't pretend to be gourmet. It just filled you up and made the most of what you had. Today, Spam is having a bit of a nostalgic revival, popping up in trendy diners and fusion dishes. But long before the foodies caught on, it was the frugal home cook who understood its true potential. Spam and potato hash wasn't just a meal. It was proof that with a little heat and a good skillet, even the most modest ingredients could taste like something worth waking up for. Leftover mashed potato cakes were one of those quiet kitchen triumphs that turned scraps into something that felt intentional, even special. In 1950s America, especially in households where waste was frowned upon and leftovers were a daily reality, these golden patties were both a clever solution and a crowd pleaser. Mashed potatoes, once served warm and fluffy alongside last night's meatloaf or roast, didn't always reheat well the next day, but mixed with a few pantry staples and fried to a crisp, they were reborn. The beauty of mashed potato cakes was how adaptable they were. The basic idea was simple. Take cold mashed potatoes, whether plain, buttery, or seasoned, and mix in an egg, a bit of flour, maybe a handful of chopped onion or shredded cheese if you had it. The mixture was formed into little patties, about the size of a biscuit, and dropped into a hot, greased skillet. The outside crisped to a deep golden brown, while the inside stayed creamy and soft, almost like the filling of a croquette. It was the kind of transformation that made you feel like a magician, rather than just a home cook. They were often served with a fried egg or a spoonful of applesauce, depending on whether you leaned savory or sweet that morning. Some folks even tossed in bits of ham or bacon if there were leftovers from Sunday breakfast. But even in their most minimal form, just potatoes, egg, and a pinch of salt, these cakes delivered satisfaction. They were crispy, comforting, and deeply tied to a rhythm of cooking that respected both thrift and taste. Modern meal prep gurus might call it upcycling, but to the cooks of the 1950s, it was just common sense. Why throw away something perfectly good when you could fry it into something better? Mashed potato cakes were more than just a recipe. They were a philosophy that with a hot skillet, a little resourcefulness, and yesterday's dinner, you could feed your family again today. No apologies needed. In a world now obsessed with novelty, they remind us that some of the best meals come not from invention, but reinvention. Beef tallow fried toast might sound like a retro foodie trend, but back in the 1950s, it was simply breakfast done right, with what you had and without apology. Before vegetable oils and butter substitutes dominated grocery aisles, beef tallow was a common cooking fat in many households, especially those that believed in using every part of the animal. When a roast was cooked or a batch of suet trimmed, the rendered fat wasn't thrown out. It was saved in a jar, set by the stove, and used in everything from frying eggs to greasing pans. And when it came to bread, nothing transformed day-old slices quite like a good sizzle in hot tallow. This wasn't fancy French toast with cream and cinnamon. It was simpler, more primal. Just a slab of slightly stale bread, white sandwich loaf or homemade if you were lucky, pressed into a hot pan of beef tallow until golden and crisp around the edges, the kind of crisp that shatters when you bite into it. The inside stayed tender. The outside sang with savory, meaty richness. It wasn't subtle, but it was satisfying in the way only old-fashioned food can be. For folks in rural communities or working-class homes, this kind of toast wasn't just breakfast. It was fuel, paired with black coffee, maybe an egg if rationing wasn't tight, or if the backyard hens had been generous, tallow-fried toast was a fast, filling way to start the day. And it didn't pretend to be anything more. It wasn't trying to be healthy or gourmet. It was just delicious and made perfect sense when you had bread and leftover roast drippings, but not much else. Today, we might call it nose-to-tail sustainability or rediscover it under a slick of Instagram filters. But it's the same idea. Use everything, waste nothing, and make it taste good. Beef tallow fried toast is a bite of history, a sizzling reminder that flavor doesn't always come from fancy ingredients. It often lives in the scraps and sizzles, in the frugality of forgotten breakfasts, and in the wisdom of those who knew how to make do and make it delicious. Johnny cakes are one of those breakfasts that bridge generations, geographies, and deeply rooted traditions. Known throughout different parts of America under varying names, hotcakes, ash cakes, journey cakes, the Johnny cake has its roots in both Native American and Southern culinary history. In the 1950s, especially in rural and Southern kitchens, they remained a morning staple not because they were trendy, but because they were reliable, comforting, and incredibly simple to make. Made primarily from cornmeal, water, and a pinch of salt, Johnny cakes were the kind of dish that could be whipped up with what little was left in the pantry. No eggs, no milk necessary, though if you had some, they could be added for richness. The batter was poured or patted into a hot, greased skillet, often cast iron, and cooked until golden and crisp on the outside, soft and hearty inside. The texture fell somewhere between a pancake and cornbread, and they were often eaten plain or slathered with butter, syrup, or molasses, depending on what was on hand. Their origins go way back to indigenous tribes who used ground maize to make early versions of flat cakes cooked on hot stones or in the ashes of a fire. Enslaved people in the South later adapted the recipe into hoe cakes, using the limited ingredients available to them and cooking them on hoe blades over open fires. Over time, Johnny cakes became a kind of cultural hand-me-down, morphing with each region and generation, but always keeping their humble essence. In the 1950s, these cakes were still very much alive in the American breakfast table rotation, especially in communities where cornmeal was a staple and resourcefulness was second nature. They were filling, cheap, and versatile, qualities every post-war household valued. And unlike fluffy diner pancakes or processed toaster treats, Johnny cakes had character. They tasted like history, like heritage, like something passed down not in cookbooks, but by memory and muscle. Today, Johnny cakes remind us of a slower, more thoughtful kind of cooking, where ingredients were basic, but the flavor and legacy were rich. A crispy, golden bite into one is a bite into centuries of making do, making better, and making breakfast matter. Scotch oatmeal cakes were the quiet achievers of the 1950s breakfast table, a holdover from old-world frugality that found a home in American kitchens where oats were plentiful and budgets were tight. With roots stretching back to the Scottish Highlands, these humble cakes were simple, sturdy, and deeply satisfying. In their traditional form, they were made from finely ground oats, a bit of salt, and just enough fat and hot water to bring everything together into a workable dough. They weren't sweet, they weren't fluffy, and they definitely weren't trying to be flashy. But for families who valued a warm, filling start to the day, they were just the thing. The process was honest and hands-on. The oats, often ground at home or bought in bulk, were mixed with a bit of lard or butter if you had it, then formed into thin rounds and cooked on a griddle or baked on a hot sheet. What emerged was a crisp-edged, slightly chewy cake that tasted of toasted grain and quiet comfort. If you had jam, it went on top. If you didn't, a swipe of margarine did just fine. And if you were lucky enough to have a dab of honey or syrup, well, that turned breakfast into something just shy of indulgent. In the 1950s, these cakes made sense. They were made from ingredients that were cheap, shelf-stable, and already in most pantries. Oatmeal was wholesome, and oats stretched far, especially important for large families trying to feed many mouths without breaking the bank. There was also a certain calm predictability to them. No rising time, no complex steps, just a rhythm of mixing, shaping, and griddling. Today, Scotch oatmeal cakes have the kind of rustic charm that health food bloggers and vintage cookbook collectors swoon over. But back then, they weren't aesthetic. They were efficient. They reminded people of roots and resilience, of Scottish ancestors or Depression-era habits passed down with a nod and a recipe scribbled on a stained index card. In an age of frosted cereals and toaster pastries, there's something oddly comforting about a crisp oatcake that doesn't ask for attention, only appreciation. German farmer's breakfast is one of those glorious one-pan wonders that feels like it was made not just for sustenance but for survival, with a wink of pleasure on the side. In 1950s America, especially in immigrant communities and rural farm towns, this dish wasn't considered anything fancy. It was just what you did with leftovers. Cold boiled or roasted potatoes from the night before, an onion that needed using, and a few eggs to pull everything together. But simple as it was, this breakfast packed a punch in both flavor and frugality. You'd start by frying up the chopped potatoes in a skillet, cast iron if you were serious about your breakfast game, until they developed a golden, crispy edge. The onions would go in next, chopped roughly, sizzling and softening into something sweet and savory. Then, just when everything smelled exactly like what you wanted to wake up to, you'd crack a few eggs right into the pan. Some folks stirred it all together, scrambling the eggs into the mix. Others let the eggs fry right on top, so you'd get creamy yolks alongside crunchy potatoes. Either way, the result was something deeply satisfying, hearty, warm, and exactly what a working morning called for. Though it hails from German peasant tradition, this dish spoke the same language as every frugal cook across the Midwest and beyond. Use what you've got, don't waste a thing, and make it taste good. In many ways, it echoed the values of the 1950s household: resourceful, unpretentious, and rooted in practicality. This wasn't a dish made to impress guests. It was made to feed the family and fuel the day. Today, the German farmer's breakfast might show up on brunch menus with fancy names or garnishes, but its soul hasn't changed. It's still about warmth and thrift and scraping together something better than you thought you had. It reminds us that some of the best breakfasts come not from recipes, but from routines, ones born out of necessity and made memorable by the scent of onions frying in the morning air. The overnight oatmeal bake might sound like something dreamed up by modern meal preppers, but its roots stretch deep into mid-century kitchens where efficiency, thrift, and the promise of a warm morning were everything. In the 1950s, this dish offered busy homemakers a way to make breakfast feel both hearty and homey without a chaotic early morning kitchen mess. With a little prep the night before, nothing more than stirring together oats, milk, a beaten egg or two, and whatever add-ins were on hand, you could go to bed knowing breakfast would practically make itself. Typically made with rolled oats, quick oats if you were in a rush, powdered milk or evaporated milk, and maybe some mashed bananas, canned fruit, or a scoop of raisins if you were feeling generous. The whole mixture was poured into a greased casserole dish, covered and tucked into the icebox overnight. Come morning, it went straight into the oven to bake into something warm, soft, and subtly sweet, the kind of breakfast that made you linger a little longer at the table. It wasn't flashy, but it was comforting. The top would brown gently, the inside staying custardy and tender. A bit of cinnamon or nutmeg gave it just enough aroma to make the kitchen smell like a Norman Rockwell painting. Leftovers? Rare. But if there were any, they reheated beautifully. This was the kind of dish that told a story, not just of economic practicality, but of care. You didn't make an overnight oatmeal bake unless you were thinking about tomorrow. It was a small act of love, a nod to the coming day, and a promise that even when money was tight or time was short, there could still be something warm and filling waiting in the oven. Now, of course, we see versions of it on wellness blogs and Pinterest boards, layered with chia seeds and almond milk. But the 1950s version was all about making do, with flavor, heart, and whatever pantry scraps were available. It's proof that the best breakfasts don't always come in boxes or drive-through bags. Sometimes they come from a quiet bowl, chilled overnight, and baked with intention. Baked bean breakfast bowl might not sound glamorous, but in the 1950s, it was a warm, filling start to the day that didn't cost much more than a few cents and some clever pantry raiding. At its heart, this dish was about two things: making use of leftovers and getting enough calories into the morning to keep working-class families energized well past noon. Baked beans, canned or homemade, were a staple in many households, and by breakfast time, they were often reheated with a little extra seasoning, maybe a splash of ketchup or vinegar if they dried out overnight, and served alongside or on top of hearty accompaniments. Often a scoop of beans was nestled into a bowl with yesterday's fried potatoes or torn-up toast, or even spooned over a slice of cornbread. If eggs were available, a soft fried egg might crown the bowl, yolk running luxuriously into the beans below. Sometimes, folks added a crumble of bacon if there was any left from the weekend. But usually, the beans were the star. Rich, sweet, savory, smoky, and endlessly comforting. It was common in factory towns and farming communities alike, especially in the Northeast where Boston baked beans had long been a tradition. This wasn't just about convenience. It was about holding on to every last bit of food value. Beans were cheap, high in protein, and paired beautifully with whatever starch you had on hand. In times when waste wasn't an option, dishes like this were breakfast gold. The baked bean breakfast bowl also had the kind of slow, satisfying energy that modern nutritionists would admire. Though back then, no one was counting macros. They were counting pennies, and this dish made them stretch. Today, you might find something similar on a hip cafe menu labeled as heirloom bean hash or rustic breakfast skillet. But the soul is the same. It's about warmth, comfort, and the kind of breakfast that doesn't just fill you up, it steadies you for the day ahead, with nothing more than a spoon and a second helping if you're lucky. Leftover meatloaf and egg sandwich was never the kind of breakfast you'd see in a glossy magazine spread, but in the 1950s, it was the unspoken hero of the frugal kitchen. This was the meal you made the morning after Sunday dinner, when a thick slab of yesterday's meatloaf still sat in the icebox, wrapped in wax paper and waiting for a second act. It was never about reinvention. It was about respect. Respect for food, for hard work, and for not letting a single bite go to waste. To make it, you'd slice the meatloaf cold, then fry it in a pan with just a bit of grease until the edges crisped and caramelized. That alone was enough to make the kitchen smell like a diner at 7 a.m. Then came the egg, fried in the same pan, sunny side up or over easy if you liked a runny yolk, scrambled if you needed it to stay put, sandwiched between 2 slices of toasted white bread or whatever loaf hadn't gone stale. This combination was filling, savory, and oddly elegant in its own way. It was the kind of breakfast that made sense in a household that prized leftovers and didn't shy away from hearty fare. You weren't eating this on the way to school or work. You sat down and used both hands. It was a breakfast with weight, literally and figuratively. And if you added a smear of ketchup, a slice of cheese, or even a leaf of wilted lettuce, it became a full meal disguised as a sandwich. Today, we live in a world obsessed with brunch innovations. But back then, this meatloaf and egg number was innovation born of necessity. It was economical, yes, but it was also smart. It said, we worked hard to make this meal once, and we're going to enjoy it again, differently. That's kitchen wisdom at its finest. And maybe it didn't have the finesse of a croissant sandwich or the bright colors of an acai bowl, but one bite into a crisp fried slice of meatloaf and a warm egg, and you'd know it had all the flavor and none of the waste. The sugar sandwich, just white bread, butter, and a generous sprinkle of sugar, was the kind of breakfast that didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was: sweet, simple, and deeply comforting. In the 1950s, it was a go-to for families stretched thin, a little indulgence pulled straight from the pantry shelves. No eggs, no bacon, no problem. If you had bread, a stick of margarine or real butter, and the ever-present sugar canister, you had a breakfast that could put a smile on a child's face and keep them going until lunch. There were variations, of course. Some folks toasted the bread to give it crunch. Others left it soft, the butter soaking into each fluffy slice. Sometimes it was made open-faced, with sugar scattered like glitter over the top. Other times it was pressed together, the sugar crunching between layers like tiny crystals of rebellion. It wasn't fancy, but it had a magic all its own, the kind of magic that made you feel rich for a moment, even if your pockets were empty. This was more than just a poor man's pastry. It was a reminder that joy didn't have to be complicated or expensive. In kitchens where powdered milk was mixed with tap water and meat was stretched with breadcrumbs, the sugar sandwich was a tiny luxury. It was made fast, eaten faster, and remembered for years. For many kids, it was the closest thing they got to dessert before dinner. Modern nutritionists would faint, of course. White bread, saturated fat, straight sugar. But in that era, calories were currency, and a sugar sandwich was a warm deposit in the bank of the day. Today's foodies might raise an eyebrow, but in the 1950s, this was comfort food with no apologies. You didn't need a recipe, just a little something sweet to hold you over. And maybe that's why it stuck in the memory so well, because even when times were hard, there was always a way to turn 3 humble ingredients into something that felt a bit like love, handed to you on a plate. Hot water cornbread is one of those dishes that doesn't ask for much but gives back plenty. Just cornmeal, a little salt, maybe a spoonful of lard or bacon grease, and of course, boiling water. That's it. No eggs, no milk, no sugar. It was born from necessity, shaped by hands that couldn't afford waste, and passed down through generations who knew how to turn scarcity into sustenance. While its roots run deep in the American South, particularly in African American kitchens, by the 1950s, hot water cornbread had a home on many breakfast tables, especially in rural areas where boxed mixes hadn't quite replaced tradition. The preparation is as straightforward as it sounds. You mix scalding hot water into cornmeal until it forms a stiff, gritty dough, then shape it into small patties and fry them, often in the same pan that cooked bacon or sausage, because why waste good grease? The sizzling sound alone was enough to get kids out of bed, and the smell? Pure golden comfort. What came out of that skillet was something between a fritter and a biscuit, crisp on the outside, tender inside, and ready to be slathered in butter, syrup, or even beans if you were looking for more heft. But it wasn't just about filling stomachs. Hot water cornbread was a lesson. It taught thrift, patience, and the art of making do. It was frugal, yes, but not flavorless. Every bite told a story, not just of survival, but of ingenuity, of pride in doing a lot with a little. In an age when breakfast often meant cereal from a box or toast from a machine, this was hands-on food. It was hot, hearty, and meant to be eaten right away. Today, it might seem rustic or old-fashioned, maybe even forgotten outside of certain circles. But hot water cornbread deserves a revival, not just as a recipe, but as a reminder that sometimes all you really need is a handful of cornmeal and some boiling water to make something worth remembering. Day-old coffee toast. Dip wasn't written down in any recipe book. It was more of a ritual than a meal, passed down not through instruction but by the quiet habits of tired hands around a breakfast table. In the 1950s, when coffee was perked in big enamel pots and every drop mattered, wasting it was unthinkable. That's where this humble breakfast came in. You had stale toast, and you had yesterday's coffee, cooled, reheated on the stove, maybe with a little extra sugar or milk stirred in. Together, they made something surprisingly soulful, a poor man's pick-me-up that was more about comfort than calories. Picture this, a kitchen still chilly from the night, the smell of warm coffee hanging in the air, and a plate of toast. Not fresh or buttery, just plain slices gone a little tough around the edges. You dunk them directly into your mug or soup bowl, watching the crusts soften as the coffee soaked in. The toast would absorb the bitterness, mellowing it, and in return, the coffee took on a bready richness. You didn't eat it daintily, you dipped until the toast gave way, then you spooned or slurped the rest. This wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't brunch. But for factory workers, farmers, and frugal families, it was fuel. It was also one of those make-do meals that quietly said, we may not have much, but we'll make something of it. And something about that combination, the bold, slightly burnt taste of reheated coffee and the humble honesty of day-old bread, gave the morning a sense of grounding. In today's world of pour-over snobbery and artisanal loaves, dipping white bread in yesterday's coffee sounds like culinary heresy. But back then, it was a small moment of practicality, maybe even comfort. It tasted like adulthood and resilience. And oddly enough, for those who grew up with it, that first bite of coffee-soaked toast could still take them right back to chipped mugs, crowded kitchens, and mornings that started with nothing more than warmth and will. So, which one are you brave enough to try? Call back to Grandma's habits, frugality, resilience. Like, subscribe, and share the video with your breakfast for dinner crew. In times of inflation, burnout, or broken toasters, maybe the past isn't such a bad place to visit.